HOA Karen burned my house and had the nerve to show up in court. That title alone could have been the headline of my life. A story that started with something as ordinary as neighborhood control and ended in smoke, ashes, and disbelief. It all began in a quiet, perfectly trimmed suburb. The kind of place where the grass was always too green and everyone smiled just a little too wide. Behind those white fences and manicured lawns hid the real force that ruled the streets. The HOA, led by one woman who treated her title like royalty, Karen. She wasn't the kind of Karen who just complained about trash cans or loud music. She was the kind who made it her mission to own every corner of peace anyone else tried to build. When I moved into Maple Crest Estates, I thought it would be a new start, a safe place for me and my small family, away from city chaos. But in neighborhoods like these, calm was an illusion. The first letter came 3 days after I painted my mailbox black instead of the HOA-approved beige. Then came the visits, the warnings, the fake smiles. Karen made sure her rules felt like law. She inspected lawns like a drill sergeant and whispered to anyone who'd listen about who didn't fit in. But I kept my head down. I paid the fees, followed the codes, even repainted the mailbox. Until one morning, a simple misunderstanding turned into a spark, one that would burn everything I had. The conflict started over a fence. I replaced the old wooden panels that had been rotting for months, using a darker stain that matched my home's trim. It looked better, stronger, but apparently it violated aesthetic harmony. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting, her voice shrill over the phone lines, accusing me of undermining community standards. The absurdity of it all would have been funny if it hadn't turned ugly so fast. Letters escalated to fines, fines to threats, threats to hostility. I'd catch her standing near my property line, taking photos, muttering to herself. It wasn't about a fence anymore. It was about control. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it. Some even pitied me, but none dared to speak up. Then, the night everything changed came quietly, almost too quietly. The air was heavy, the sky strangely red as I drove home late from work. My house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, peaceful and still, until I saw the glow, faint at first, then consuming. Flames clawed at the windows, smoke curled into the night sky. I froze. My home, my safe place, was burning. The fire spread fast, the heat unbearable even from the street. Neighbors gathered, their faces pale and helpless. Someone called 911. Someone else shouted my name. But all I could see were memories turning to ash. The photo albums, the couch where my daughter learned to walk, the walls we painted together on weekends. The fire department arrived, hoses spraying into a storm of sparks. But it was too late. Everything was gone. I stood there, numb, with nothing but the smell of smoke and disbelief in my lungs. When the flames finally died, all that remained were twisted beams and blackened stone. And as the morning sun rose over what used to be my life, I noticed something strange, the faint outline of a shoe print near the side gate, where the fire had started. Not random, not accidental. Someone had done this, someone had made it personal. And deep down, I already knew who. The neighborhood whispers came quickly, quiet but sharp. Some said it was faulty wiring, others said it was a tragic accident. But the way Karen avoided me, the way her voice cracked when she said, "Such a shame," it told me more than words ever could. I reported everything to the police, handed them every detail, every letter, every threat she'd ever sent. But in neighborhoods ruled by charm and fake smiles, truth doesn't spread easily. Weeks went by. The investigation was slow, careful, political. But justice has a way of revealing itself, sometimes quietly, sometimes all at once. When the detective called me one morning, his voice was low and steady. "We have something." Surveillance footage from a nearby house caught movement that night. A figure near my property, carrying something. The timestamp matched the fire's origin. The clothes were familiar. The posture, the way she walked. It was Karen. The woman who lectured about community values, who fined me for a fence stain, had crossed the line no one could come back from. And she wasn't just guilty, she was proud. Because when the police came for her, she didn't deny it. She called it poetic justice. She said my house was an eyesore that needed to go. That night, watching her in handcuffs, standing on the street where she once ruled, I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just silence. But what came next was something I could have never predicted. A few months later, the same woman who burned my house to the ground walked into my courtroom, dressed neatly, calm as ever, for her sentencing. And when our eyes met, she smiled. When Karen walked into that courtroom, I swear the air changed. It wasn't just the echo of her heels across the polished floor. It was the audacity that clung to her like perfume. The woman who burned my house down wasn't hiding behind shame or fear. She carried herself like she was attending another HOA meeting. Calm, polished, entitled. For months, I'd replayed the fire in my head, imagining justice as something clean and final. But seeing her there, smiling like she still owned the neighborhood, made me realize this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The trial had drawn quiet attention. Neighbors who once whispered behind fences now filled the benches, pretending to be concerned citizens. Some came out of guilt, some out of curiosity. The HOA board members, those same people who used to side with Karen on every rule, sat rigid and silent, eyes darting between us. They didn't want to be seen supporting her, but they couldn't bring themselves to condemn her either. Because deep down, Karen represented everything the HOA really was: power without empathy. When the judge entered, the room fell into a hush. I sat in the front row, hands clenched, feeling every second stretch. The prosecutor started laying out the evidence, the security footage, the shoe print, the accelerant residue that matched a can found in her garage. Every piece fit perfectly, but Karen didn't flinch. Her lawyer painted her as emotionally distraught, a woman driven to a breaking point by years of community tension. They said she was overwhelmed by stress, that the act wasn't premeditated, but a tragic mistake of the moment. I wanted to stand up and shout, "A mistake doesn't last for minutes," while flames spread through my life. But I stayed silent, because anger, in court, is ammunition for the guilty. When it was my turn to give a statement, I stood, feeling every eye in the room lock onto me. The microphone caught my breath before my voice. I told them about the letters, the fines, the harassment, the threats. I told them how she stood outside my home, taking photos like a predator watching its prey. I described that night, the smell, the heat, the sound of my walls collapsing. I told them how my daughter still wakes up crying, afraid of the dark orange glow that haunts her dreams. And then I said something I hadn't planned to say. She didn't just burn my house, she burned my peace. For the first time, Karen's expression shifted, not to guilt, not to fear, but to irritation. Like my pain was an inconvenience interrupting her schedule. The judge watched her closely after that. When the evidence replayed on the screen, grainy footage of her sneaking around my property, carrying that small red canister, the room went silent. You could hear the air conditioner hum. It was her, clear as daylight. She had done it with purpose. The prosecutor looked satisfied, but I didn't. Because even as her guilt became undeniable, her smirk stayed. The trial lasted 3 days, but it felt like months. The HOA tried to distance themselves, pretending they'd always discouraged her behavior. Lies. Not one of them spoke when she targeted me. Not one lifted a finger when she vandalized my mailbox and left notes like "You don't belong here." They only acted shocked when the flames got too high to ignore. On the final day, when the judge read the verdict, guilty of arson, property destruction, and endangerment, the relief I expected never came. Because even then, she turned to me, smiled that same smug smile, and whispered something to her lawyer that made them both grin. I didn't hear the words, but I knew the look. It was the look of someone who believed she'd still win somehow, that even if she lost her freedom, she'd find a way to keep her grip on my life. After the sentencing, she was to serve 5 years, a light punishment for the chaos she caused. But it was justice nonetheless. I thought it would feel final. It didn't. Because when she was being escorted out, she turned back, met my eyes, and mouthed 2 words that froze me where I stood. Not over. The next few weeks after the trial were strange. I expected peace, closure, maybe even quiet. But Maple Crest Estates doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. The HOA tried to rebuild its image, sending out community newsletters about healing and togetherness. They even had the nerve to ask if I wanted to rejoin the association once I rebuilt my home. I didn't respond. I was living temporarily in a small rental on the edge of town, just far enough to breathe, but close enough to drive by the wreckage every few days. The lot still smelled faintly of smoke. The insurance company had started their process, but even paperwork felt heavy, like reliving it all again in black and white. Then, strange things began happening. Anonymous letters left in my mailbox. Simple words like, "You deserved it and this isn't finished." No return address, no handwriting I recognized. I reported them, but the police said they couldn't trace anything without more evidence. Some neighbors stopped waving when they saw me. Others crossed the street. It felt like I was the problem, not the victim. That's how these HOA communities worked. When one of their own fell, they'd rather erase the memory than face it. I spent nights scrolling through old HOA chat logs, screenshots, anything that could explain why she targeted me so personally. That's when I found something I'd missed before. A private message thread between Karen and another board member, discussing trouble homeowners. My name was there underlined. Next to it, a note that read, "He'll either comply or he'll leave." That was the plan all along. I was never meant to belong there. The rules, the harassment, the fire, all of it had been part of her twisted control over the community. And even though she was behind bars now, her influence lingered like smoke after a blaze. Some of her allies still sat on that HOA board, still running things quietly, still pushing anyone who dared to question them. They called it maintaining order. I called it poison. One evening, as I drove past the ruins of my old home, I saw something that made my heart skip. A new sign had been placed near the lot. Future site of Maple Crest Community Park, HOA-sponsored project. They were building over my land. The land I still owned. Without my consent, I stopped the car, stared at it, and felt that same helpless fire rise in my chest again. They weren't just done with me, they were erasing me. That night, I made a decision. If they wanted silence, they wouldn't get it. I was done being polite, done following their fake rules. Karen's smile in court had been a message, a warning. But she underestimated one thing. When you burn a man's home, you don't destroy him. You forge him. The ashes of my house weren't the end of my story. They were the beginning of something bigger. A reckoning that Maple Crest had coming for a long time. After Karen's sentencing, one would think the neighborhood would settle into a tense but quiet calm. Yet Maple Crest Estates had other plans. The moment she left the courtroom, whispers began circulating among the HOA board and residents alike, eyes darting toward anyone who might challenge the status quo. I thought the worst was over, but what I didn't anticipate was how deeply the seeds of fear and control had taken root in this community. Within weeks, subtle harassment started again, not directly from Karen, but orchestrated through the HOA's network of loyal neighbors. Notices appeared on lawns for minor violations, emails flew with veiled threats, and some construction workers seemed to intentionally delay any repairs on my property. It was clear. The HOA had decided to make an example out of me, and in doing so, they were also testing who else might resist their authority. One morning, as I drove past the vacant lot that once held my home, I noticed an unusual amount of activity. Trucks, vans, and unfamiliar faces dotted the landscape. They were surveying, measuring, photographing, almost as if mapping territory. When I asked around, neighbors whispered excuses. "It's a new landscaping project. They're planning a community park. Don't worry about it." But I could feel it in my gut. This wasn't landscaping. It was intimidation. The HOA was sending a message that no one dared defy them, that the consequences of resistance were permanent. My insurance company called with updates, and while they processed the claim for my lost property, they expressed concern over potential legal disputes surrounding the lot. I realized that the fight wasn't only about the fire anymore. It was about ownership, authority, and control, and I had stepped squarely into their crosshairs. That weekend, I began documenting everything. Visits from suspicious neighbors, small acts of sabotage, letters and emails that hinted at continued hostility. I recorded every phone call, photographed every inspection, and even started logging minor encounters in my community. My life became a constant balancing act. Between the trauma of losing my home, the fear of ongoing harassment, and the determination to prove that even without a house, I wasn't going to be silenced. And then came the first sign that Karen's influence extended far beyond her immediate presence. One afternoon, a young couple who had recently moved in approached me cautiously. They claimed they'd seen Karen lingering near my property the night of the fire, noting details that even the police hadn't fully disclosed. But more shocking was what they told me about the HOA. "She's been coaching them," they said, "telling them how to handle people like you. You're not alone, but everyone who opposes her gets watched." The idea that she could reach into the neighborhood from behind bars was chilling. I realized that Maplecrest Estates had become a living organism with Karen at its nucleus, manipulating behavior and spreading fear through silent, calculated control. The next month, another confrontation occurred. I received an official notice claiming I had violated obscure community codes, citing minor discrepancies in temporary fencing around the burned lot, despite the fact that I was legally allowed to maintain it for safety reasons. The HOA's demands escalated quickly, insisting on immediate corrections or facing penalties. This time, the intimidation was public. Board members gathered at the lot under the guise of inspection, whispering in a circle as if orchestrating some ritual of power. Their eyes followed me, measuring, judging, daring me to resist. But I had learned by now that resistance was the only option. I refused to comply immediately, recording the interactions and gathering witnesses from supportive neighbors who had also started noticing the HOA's overreach. The tension in the community escalated further when a small group of HOA supporters attempted to block access to the lot, setting up temporary barricades under the pretense of safety. My friends and a few courageous neighbors intervened, and the scene devolved into a standoff. Words exchanged, cameras raised, and a silent acknowledgement that this battle had become more than just property. It was a struggle over freedom, voice, and rights within a supposedly peaceful suburban enclave. Even the local police began taking interest, responding to multiple calls about harassment, intimidation, and attempts to restrict lawful access. While they couldn't intervene in HOA policies directly, their presence confirmed that the situation was escalating beyond the norm, catching attention that perhaps the HOA hadn't anticipated. One evening, as I reviewed footage of the board's activity around my property, I noticed a pattern. The same faces appearing repeatedly, always surveying, always whispering. The more I documented, the clearer it became that this wasn't random behavior, but a coordinated effort designed to wear me down psychologically. The community that once felt like a safe haven now resembled a pressure cooker of scrutiny and manipulation. In spite of all this, a quiet determination grew within me. Karen's smirk in the courtroom, her whispered threats, the HOA's coordinated harassment, none of it would break me. I began reaching out to legal advisors, journalists, and advocacy groups familiar with HOA abuse. I documented timelines, collected statements, and assembled evidence not just of Karen's past actions, but of the HOA's ongoing violations. What had started as a personal attack was now unfolding into a larger story, one that exposed systemic control in this supposedly idyllic suburban neighborhood. Weeks passed, and the tension escalated to a breaking point. During a board meeting convened at a neighbor's home, I watched as members openly discussed handling residents who resisted HOA rules. The language was chilling, calculated, and precise. Every word reinforced the idea that Maplecrest Estates operated under a rigid hierarchy, enforced not just by regulations, but by fear, surveillance, and intimidation. This wasn't about community standards. It was about dominance. It was then that I decided the next step. I would not allow Karen or the HOA to continue their campaign unchallenged. I would use every legal tool, every ally, and every bit of evidence to show that their actions had consequences. I filed motions, gathered testimony, and prepared for hearings that would challenge not only the individual perpetrators, but the structure that enabled their tyranny. The sense of urgency intensified when another neighbor approached, confiding that Karen had begun targeting their property as well. Their lawn had been photographed obsessively, minor infractions exaggerated, and complaints filed under false pretenses. It became clear that Karen's influence extended far beyond me. The HOA had become a machine of control, and I was no longer a single target. I was the spark that could ignite exposure, revealing their systemic abuse to the entire community. By the end of the month, I had compiled a full dossier. Photographs, witness statements, recordings, HOA documents, and news clippings that mapped out not only Karen's actions, but the board's complicity. The file was heavy, both in weight and in significance. It represented months of trauma, vigilance, and perseverance, but it was also my weapon. I realized that the fight was no longer personal. It was about accountability, transparency, and the future of Maplecrest Estates. And as I looked over the documents, I understood something vital. Karen may have burned my house, and the HOA may have tried to burn my spirit, but they had underestimated my resilience, my determination, and the power of exposing the truth. The battle was far from over, but I knew the next chapters would shift the balance. And this time, I would dictate the story. After weeks of gathering evidence, reviewing footage, and documenting the subtle, insidious harassment, I realized the problem at Maple Crest Estates went far beyond Karen. The HOA board itself had become a machine of control, a shadow network designed to maintain dominance over every homeowner, and my fight against one woman had become a fight against the system. I spent nights poring over emails, community memos, meeting notes, and neighborhood newsletters, piecing together a timeline of abuse, intimidation, and corruption. Every document, every whisper, every interaction told the same story. The board knew, encouraged, and in many ways orchestrated Karen's actions to ensure that anyone who resisted the HOA's authority would be pressured, shamed, and ultimately pushed to comply. With a clear strategy in mind, I began reaching out to investigative journalists, legal advisors, and advocacy groups that specialized in HOA misconduct. I compiled everything into a master file: photographs of surveillance, records of threats, documented fines and notices, testimonies from neighbors who had remained silent out of fear, and even records showing the board's direct communication with Karen in the weeks leading up to the arson. Every piece of evidence strengthened the story and the case. Then I scheduled a meeting with the local press. Sitting in a small, quiet cafe with a reporter, I laid out the narrative, explaining how Karen had burned my house, how her influence persisted through the HOA, and how the board had silently enabled the chaos. The reporter's eyes widened at the layers of manipulation and systemic abuse, and by the time we left, an article had already been drafted, promising to expose the HOA in ways that would shock the community. Back in the neighborhood, subtle acts of defiance began to ripple outward. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak started leaving anonymous letters, photographs, and small notes documenting instances of harassment. Some began quietly repairing their homes according to their preferences, refusing to comply with petty or arbitrary rules. The message was clear: resistance was possible, and the aura of control the HOA had cultivated for years was beginning to crack. Despite these small victories, the tension escalated dramatically when the board called an emergency meeting, claiming it was necessary to maintain order. I attended, armed with my evidence and a quiet determination that this time no manipulation would go unnoticed. Inside the community hall, I watched familiar faces shuffle nervously, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering to each other. The board members took their seats, exuding a false sense of authority, but I could see the subtle cracks, the unease in their posture, the hesitation in their tone. When I presented the evidence, projecting photographs and documents onto the screen, the room fell silent. The board tried to dismiss my claims, labeling them as an exaggeration or isolated incidents. But I had prepared for every excuse. I walked them through Karen's direct messages, their own emails authorizing inspections and fines, and the patterns of intimidation that spanned months. One by one, I showed how the system had been complicit in not just one act of violence, but in an ongoing pattern of control that endangered homeowners and children alike. The tension in the room was palpable. Some board members' faces turned red, others avoided my gaze entirely. Whispers erupted as neighbors began murmuring among themselves, realizing that the walls of secrecy had been breached. For the first time, it felt like the balance of power had shifted, and then the subtle retaliation began. I noticed certain neighbors, once supportive, being warned quietly by other board members, their eyes pleading for discretion. It was clear that while some wanted change, the fear instilled by years of HOA dominance still held strong. That fear would have been enough to deter many, but I refused to let it stop me. Over the next few weeks, I coordinated with attorneys to submit formal complaints to state regulatory agencies overseeing HOAs. Every letter cited documented harassment, intimidation, financial abuse, and complicity in criminal acts, specifically highlighting the fire and the board's awareness of Karen's dangerous behavior. The legal pressure began to mount. Board members started receiving inquiries, notices, and demands for accountability that they could no longer ignore. Even the local press ran follow-up articles, highlighting the systemic issues within Maple Crest Estates. I watched as their grip on the neighborhood weakened. Small acts of courage spread like wildfire. Neighbors began speaking up, refusing to comply with petty regulations, attending meetings armed with evidence, and documenting every interaction. The culture of silence that Karen and the board had relied upon was crumbling. Even the children, once caught in the crossfire of intimidation, began to reclaim small freedoms, playing freely in yards, laughing openly, and no longer constrained by the constant oversight of fear. And yet, even as progress unfolded, the shadow of Karen lingered. Her influence persisted in whispers, in the way certain neighbors still flinched at her name, in the subtle intimidation the board attempted to maintain. But the fear was no longer universal. It had been fractured. One evening, reviewing a new set of board communications obtained through public records, I discovered something remarkable. There were discussions about changing HOA policies, about transparency, and about accountability, forced not by goodwill, but by public exposure and legal pressure. The board was adapting, and for the first time, their actions were reactive rather than proactive. Maple Crest Estates was no longer a fortress built on fear. Cracks had appeared, and I could see light through them. By the end of the month, I had managed to create a network of residents committed to accountability, transparency, and fairness. Meetings were no longer dominated solely by the board. Residents spoke freely, challenged rules, and documented everything. The HOA's tactics of intimidation had largely failed, and Karen's shadow had begun to fade, though the memory of her actions remained vivid. What had begun as a personal battle to reclaim my home had evolved into a movement to expose systemic wrongdoing, to protect the vulnerable, and to reclaim the true purpose of a neighborhood: community. I knew the fight was far from over. The road ahead would be filled with legal hurdles, lingering fear, and persistent resistance from those unwilling to accept change. But I also knew one undeniable truth. By exposing the board and their complicity, I had shifted the balance. The narrative that Karen and her allies controlled was no longer theirs alone. Maple Crest Estates would never again be ruled silently by fear, and I had become the catalyst for a community waking up from years of subjugation. With the board's complicity exposed and Karen behind bars, the neighborhood began to stir in ways I hadn't anticipated. What started as subtle defiance slowly turned into an organized pushback. Small acts of courage emerged, neighbors repainting their fences the way they wanted, children playing without fear of reprimand, homeowners refusing to comply with petty fines. All small victories, but each one sending a ripple through the once intimidating structure of Maple Crest Estates. I began meeting with residents in secret, holding small gatherings to discuss HOA abuses, share evidence, and strategize collective action. It was astonishing how many people had quietly endured harassment, fines, and intimidation without ever speaking up. Fear had been the tool keeping the community silent. And now, with Karen's removal and the board's exposure, that fear began to dissipate. Emails and letters circulated outlining violations, questionable inspections, and past abuses, all intended to show a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Even minor infractions, once magnified by the HOA, now became rallying points for unity. The transformation of the neighborhood was slow but visible. Where once lawns had been perfectly trimmed out of intimidation, now flowers bloomed in unexpected colors, fences were repainted in unique shades, and small decorative touches emerged that reflected individuality rather than conformity. Neighbors who had previously avoided each other now exchanged knowing glances and quiet smiles, acknowledging their shared resistance. The HOA, sensing that their control was slipping, tried to react. Notices of non-compliance appeared again, inspections were scheduled, and some board members attempted to intimidate residents by highlighting fines and obscure rules. But the unified front of the community rendered these efforts largely ineffective. For the first time, the board's threats were met with organized responses, documented objections, legal counsel, and press attention. They were losing the psychological dominance they had relied upon for decades. Even the police, who had previously been passive observers, now monitored interactions more closely, ensuring that intimidation and harassment were not carried out unchecked. This added layer of accountability empowered residents further. I began documenting everything systematically: photographs of meetings, correspondence with board members, records of fines, and testimonies from neighbors. The evidence was no longer just for my personal protection. It became the foundation for a community-wide claim, highlighting systemic abuse and compelling the HOA to act with transparency. While the rebellion was growing, I couldn't ignore the lingering presence of fear. Some neighbors, still hesitant, remained silent or hesitant to challenge authority openly. The shadow of Karen, though physically absent, lingered in the memory of those who had seen her power firsthand. It was crucial to show that resistance was not only possible but effective. Workshops and meetings were held in garages and living rooms, creating spaces for discussion, planning, and sharing resources. Slowly, trust returned to the neighborhood. Conversations became more open. Questions about rules were asked without fear, and residents began reclaiming agency over their properties. This cultural shift did not go unnoticed by the board. Panic subtly began to creep into their meetings. Attempts to impose fines, manipulate community votes, or spread misinformation were countered by legal challenges, resident advocacy, and increased media scrutiny. The HOA had become reactive, constantly forced to defend themselves against allegations of overreach rather than maintaining their former position of unquestioned authority. One particularly striking moment occurred when the board attempted to hold an emergency meeting to enforce a newly concocted rule regarding landscaping and fence heights. Residents showed up in force, armed with documented evidence of past abuses, prior approvals, and legal counsel. The meeting descended into chaos, not because of physical confrontation, but due to the overwhelming accountability presented. Board members were forced to pause, reconsider, and ultimately back down on several points, revealing cracks in the structure of power that had long seemed untouchable. Social media played an important role in this rebellion. A private group created to coordinate resident action allowed for real-time sharing of developments, discussions of legal strategy, and mutual encouragement. The sense of solidarity strengthened, and the collective energy of residents emboldened even the most hesitant individuals. Children played more freely, families hosted gatherings, and the neighborhood began to feel alive in a way it hadn't for decades. Amid this upheaval, I received word that the press was preparing an in-depth exposé on the HOA's long-standing practices. Photographs, interviews, and documentation of Karen's arson case would be included to illustrate the broader culture of intimidation that had enabled such behavior for years. The anticipation of public scrutiny added further pressure on the board, accelerating their concessions and forcing them to implement more transparent processes. While many victories were small, a waived fine here, a corrected inspection there, cumulatively they represented a shift in power. Residents had begun to understand that compliance was not mandatory and that the HOA's power derived largely from silence and fear. By actively resisting and documenting violations, they reclaimed authority over their homes and their lives. In the background, legal challenges continued to mount. Cases were filed, hearings were scheduled, and residents were armed with evidence of both Karen's actions and the board's complicity. The courts began to recognize patterns of abuse, and the HOA faced increasing liability and scrutiny. The landscape of Maple Crest Estates was changing, and the board's former reign of fear was losing credibility daily. As months passed, the neighborhood transformed not only physically, but psychologically. Gardens bloomed, fences reflected personal tastes, and children's laughter filled the air. Residents walked freely, exchanged greetings, and shared resources without fear of scrutiny. The rebellion had become not just an act of resistance, but a reclamation of the community itself. And while Karen's shadow still lingered in stories and whispered memories, the people she had tried to intimidate were no longer silenced. They had become witnesses, participants, and ultimately agents of change. By the time the HOA was forced to revise policies and implement new oversight procedures, the culture of fear that had once defined Maple Crest Estates had been dismantled. Residents now knew that unity, evidence, and persistence could challenge even the most entrenched power. And as I looked around at the neighborhood I had once feared to walk through alone, I realized that the rebellion was more than a victory. It was proof that courage, persistence, and collective action could overcome intimidation and reclaim not just homes, but community. As the neighborhood rebellion gained momentum, the legal proceedings reached their climax. Karen's sentencing was behind us, but the broader court case against the HOA and its complicit board members had become the focal point of Maple Crest Estates. The courtroom was packed with residents, journalists, and legal observers. Cameras captured every angle, every subtle glance, and every reaction. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes time stretch in slow motion. I entered the room knowing that months of documentation, evidence gathering, and community mobilization would finally be put to the ultimate test. I felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. This wasn't just about my home anymore. It was about justice for every neighbor who had been silenced, intimidated, and manipulated for decades. The board members sat rigidly, some trying to mask their fear with stoic expressions, others whispering among themselves in hushed tones. They had spent years cultivating authority and control, and now they were facing the consequences of every manipulative tactic they had employed. The judge, an imposing figure who carried an air of impartiality, reviewed the voluminous files I had submitted. Photographs of damage, emails, correspondence, witness statements, and documented fines created a damning record of systemic abuse. Each page turned, each document examined, reinforced the gravity of the case. Residents shifted in their seats, holding their breath, eyes darting between the board members and me. The tension was palpable. As the proceedings unfolded, the court heard testimonies from several neighbors, each recounting experiences of intimidation, arbitrary fines, and harassment. Their voices were steady, but the weight of past fear lingered in their expressions. One elderly couple described the years they had been pressured to remove personal decorations and repaint their home in colors dictated by the HOA. Another family detailed how minor landscaping choices had resulted in relentless inspections and threats. Each story reinforced the idea that Karen's arson was not an isolated incident, but rather an extension of a culture of control that the board had nurtured. Throughout the testimony, I remained calm, presenting evidence in a methodical and organized manner. I displayed photographs, emails, and official HOA notices, emphasizing the patterns of abuse and their impact on the community. The board's lawyers attempted to discredit the witnesses, labeling their accounts as exaggerations or misunderstandings. But the documentation was too thorough, the narrative too cohesive, and the weight of public attention too great. The court also reviewed the HOA's internal communications, which revealed coordination with Karen prior to the fire. These messages, previously hidden, showed that the board was not only aware of her behavior, but had implicitly encouraged it. The revelation shocked many in the room. I could see even some board members shift uneasily, realizing that their private correspondence had become public evidence. Journalists furiously took notes, knowing they were witnessing history. The testimony continued for days. Witnesses, experts, and community members contributed to a mounting pile of evidence, each reinforcing the overarching narrative. The HOA had systematically abused its authority, enabled criminal behavior, and endangered residents for years. The atmosphere in the courtroom became tense, charged with a collective desire for accountability. As the final arguments were presented, I could feel the weight of every resident's experiences, every document I had painstakingly collected, and every ounce of courage that had gone into standing up against the HOA. The prosecutor's closing statement painted a vivid picture. A community controlled through fear, intimidation, and manipulation, culminating in criminal acts that had caused irreparable harm. The defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Even the judge, who had maintained a professional distance, seemed visibly affected by the scope of abuse. When the verdict was finally announced, a hush fell over the room. Guilty. Every board member was found liable for multiple counts of misconduct, negligence, and complicity in criminal acts, including arson-related enabling. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause, tears, and whispered relief. Neighbors embraced, some crying openly, others simply nodding at one another in quiet acknowledgement of victory. I felt a wave of emotion. Relief mingled with vindication, knowing that months of relentless documentation and advocacy had led to justice not just for me, but for the entire community. The judge imposed penalties, including fines, mandatory policy reforms, and oversight measures to prevent future abuses. The board's ability to act unilaterally had been stripped, replaced by a system of transparency and accountability. This marked a turning point in Maple Crest Estate's history. Outside the courthouse, residents gathered, sharing stories and celebrating the first real victory in a long fight for fairness. Conversations were animated, filled with laughter, tears, and a renewed sense of community. I realized that what had started as a personal struggle had transformed into a collective awakening. Maple Crest Estates would no longer operate in secrecy and fear. The board's actions had been exposed, their power diminished, and the community had reclaimed agency. Even Karen, now serving her sentence, had indirectly contributed to the neighborhood's transformation. Her actions, horrific as they were, had forced residents to confront the underlying culture of intimidation, spurring a rebellion that restored balance. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood slowly began to rebuild, both physically and emotionally. Homeowners repaired property, painted fences in personal colors, and re-established gardens that had been neglected out of fear. Children played openly, families hosted gatherings, and the streets were alive with movement and connection. The cultural shift was profound. No longer dominated by fear, residents felt empowered to assert their rights, voice concerns, and participate in community decisions without intimidation. The HOA, now under strict oversight, had to operate transparently, adhering to regulations and policies designed to prevent future abuses. While the scars of past intimidation remained, the neighborhood had been forever changed. A sense of justice and resilience had replaced fear, and residents began to view their community through a lens of empowerment rather than submission. By the end of Chapter 6, it was clear that the battle had been won, but the work of maintaining fairness and vigilance remained. Maple Crest Estates had experienced a dramatic shift in culture, and the lessons learned would resonate for years to come. The journey from intimidation to empowerment was not easy, but it had proven that collective action, courage, and perseverance could overcome even the most entrenched systems of control. After the courtroom victory, Maple Crest Estates began the slow and delicate process of healing. The neighborhood that had once been paralyzed by fear and control was now filled with cautious optimism, but the wounds ran deep, and rebuilding trust and unity required more than legal victories. Residents began to organize cleanup days, repainting homes, repairing fences, and restoring yards that had been neglected for years. Children who had grown up under constant scrutiny now played openly, laughter echoing across streets that had been quiet with anxiety for far too long. I found myself at the center of this movement, not as a leader seeking attention, but as a catalyst encouraging residents to reclaim agency over their homes and lives. Meetings were held in backyards and community centers, where neighbors shared stories, exchanged resources, and discussed how to maintain the newfound transparency in HOA operations. The collective effort was extraordinary. People who had once been strangers were now collaborating, their shared experiences forging bonds stronger than any fear the HOA had imposed. However, restoring the physical neighborhood was only part of the challenge. Emotional scars lingered. Some residents remained hesitant, wary that the board could retaliate or that Karen might somehow influence the community even from prison. Counseling sessions and small support groups emerged organically, helping people process trauma, rebuild confidence, and regain a sense of safety. Slowly, the culture of intimidation that had defined Maple Crest Estates was being replaced with one of accountability, vigilance, and mutual respect. I worked tirelessly to maintain this momentum, coordinating with lawyers and local media to ensure that the HOA's new policies were enforced, that board members adhered to transparency rules, and that no one could manipulate residents through fear again. The changes were not superficial. They were structural and systemic. Policies were rewritten to prevent overreach, inspections were made accountable, and residents were given a clear voice in governance decisions. These reforms, while legal in nature, had a profound social impact, empowering families and individuals to assert their rights without hesitation. Community events, once rare and subdued, returned with renewed energy. Block parties, neighborhood barbecues, and local festivals became common again. Families shared meals, exchanged stories, and celebrated small victories together, symbolizing the neighborhood's reclamation of freedom and unity. Even pets, once restricted due to overly stringent rules, roamed more freely as the culture of fear waned. The visual transformation was equally striking. Homes were repainted in personal colors, gardens flourished, and fences reflected creativity rather than conformity. Streets once silent with caution now echoed with chatter, laughter, and the normal rhythms of daily life. The presence of children playing, neighbors conversing, and families engaging in outdoor activities served as tangible proof that the rebellion had successfully restored a sense of normalcy. But vigilance remained critical. Some board members, while legally constrained, still attempted subtle manipulation, minor misinterpretations of rules, casual warnings, or whispered comments during community gatherings. However, these attempts were met with immediate documentation, legal consultation, and collective accountability. The residents had learned the power of organization and evidence, and the HOA could no longer exploit fear as it had before. Throughout this process, I reflected on the long journey from trauma to empowerment. The fire, the intimidation, and the court battles had left lasting marks, but they had also galvanized a community to confront corruption, reclaim authority, and build a resilient, transparent environment. The lessons learned extended beyond Maple Crest Estates. They highlighted the importance of vigilance, unity, and courage in holding powerful entities accountable. By the end of the chapter, the neighborhood had not only been physically restored, but socially transformed. Homes were secure, streets were vibrant, and residents were empowered to speak freely and protect their rights. Maple Crest Estates was no longer a symbol of fear, but of resilience and collective action. The battle had been won, yet the commitment to maintaining fairness, transparency, and community unity remained ongoing. What had begun as a personal fight to recover from Karen's arson and the HOA's abuse had evolved into a broader story of neighborhood awakening, a testament to the power of courage, persistence, and collective responsibility. The stage was now set for the final chapter, where closure, reflection, and lasting justice would cement the transformation and ensure that Maple Crest Estates remained a safe, vibrant, and empowered community for generations to come. With the court victories behind us and the community rebuilding steadily, Maple Crest Estates entered a new era, one defined not by fear, intimidation, or unchecked authority, but by transparency, collective action, and a renewed sense of belonging. The journey from chaos to restoration had been long, filled with sleepless nights, emotional turmoil, and constant vigilance. But the neighborhood had emerged stronger, more cohesive, and empowered. Streets once haunted by whispers of Karen's threats now resonated with laughter, chatter, and the sound of children playing freely. Families who had previously retreated indoors now hosted gatherings, block parties, and community events, their homes decorated with personal touches that reflected individuality rather than forced conformity. I observed these transformations daily, understanding that the physical restoration of homes and yards was inseparable from the social and emotional rebuilding of trust and unity. Gardens flourished with colors and creativity. Fences were repainted in vibrant shades, and front porches became spaces for casual conversation and neighborly connection. Pets roamed without restriction. Children explored freely, and the atmosphere of caution and tension had been replaced by one of energy, vibrancy, and resilience. The HOA, now under strict oversight and legal constraints, had been fundamentally restructured. Board members were required to follow transparent procedures, consult legal advisors for every decision, and maintain open communication with residents. Arbitrary fines, secretive inspections, and intimidation tactics were no longer tolerated, and a culture of accountability had taken root. Residents, emboldened by their collective success, became active participants in decision-making, attending meetings, reviewing proposals, and advocating for fair policies. This transformation extended beyond legal compliance. It became a cultural shift in how the neighborhood operated, fostering mutual respect, understanding, and cooperation. The experience had also forged bonds between residents that would last for years. Neighbors who had once been hesitant or fearful were now allies, exchanging resources, offering support, and standing together in moments of uncertainty. The shared struggle against Karen and the board had created a sense of solidarity that transcended previous divisions, uniting the community in ways that had been unimaginable during the years of oppression. As I walked through the neighborhood, I could see the tangible impact of resilience. Homes bore the marks of creative restoration, children played without fear, and neighbors greeted one another warmly. Every street corner, garden, and front porch carried a story of defiance, courage, and ultimately, triumph. Even amidst celebration, the lessons of the past remained clear. Residents were vigilant, documenting interactions, staying informed of HOA policies, and ensuring that no one could manipulate fear to control the community again. The memory of Karen's actions, the arson, and the board's complicity served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that collective action, evidence, and persistence were essential to preserving justice. Local media covered the neighborhood's transformation extensively, highlighting the resilience, organization, and empowerment that had arisen from a situation that could have left the community fractured and intimidated. Stories of individual courage, family resilience, and neighborhood solidarity were shared widely, inspiring other communities facing similar challenges to take action. The legal reforms, community organization, and cultural awakening combined to create a neighborhood that was not only restored, but reborn. Maple Crest Estates had become a model of accountability, transparency, and resident empowerment, demonstrating that even entrenched systems of control could be dismantled when courage, unity, and persistence prevailed. As I reflected on the journey, it was clear that the fight against Karen and the HOA had been about more than personal justice. It had been about reclaiming community, establishing fairness, and proving that fear and intimidation could not dictate the lives of homeowners. The neighborhood's evolution was a testament to the power of collective action and the importance of standing up against corruption and abuse. Children who had witnessed the chaos now played freely, learning the value of community, accountability, and courage through example. Families celebrated milestones together, hosted gatherings, and fostered connections that strengthened social bonds and reinforced the shared commitment to justice and fairness. The streets, once silent and tense, were alive with movement, conversation, and a renewed sense of purpose. Maple Crest Estates had transformed from a place defined by intimidation to a vibrant, empowered community where residents had reclaimed their voice and agency. The lessons of resilience, transparency, and solidarity would echo for generations, ensuring that the horrors inflicted by Karen and the complicit HOA board would not be repeated. As the sun set over the newly restored neighborhood, I walked through streets filled with laughter, color, and life, recognizing that the journey had been arduous but worthwhile. The homes, the gardens, the children, and the smiles of residents were evidence of triumph, proof that determination, courage, and unity could overcome even the darkest forces of fear and control. Maple Crest Estates, once a symbol of oppression, had become a beacon of hope, resilience, and community strength. The story of HOA Karen, the fire, the court battles, and the neighborhood rebellion would be remembered not for destruction, but for the enduring power of collective action and the reclaiming of justice. And as the community continued to thrive, I knew that the legacy of courage, accountability, and neighborhood solidarity would endure long after the echoes of past fear had faded, leaving behind a neighborhood reborn, strong, united, and free.